Greetings, everyone. This is Ehav Ever from the Chronicles of Ehav Ever, and today's video is going to be a simple video answering a question that I received recently concerning the structure of the Torah. Specifically, how did Moshe or Moses write about his death? So the answer to this question is very simple, and the first thing the person has to ask is the main question: who determined the content of the Torah? So according to Torah Mosheh Jews and Jewish sources, essentially the entire content of the Torah, including all the stories that are in it, including all the information, including the spellings, the mitzvot, and all the things of that nature, were something that actually came from Hashem himself, directly to Moshe Rabbeinu. And that the general concept is that, Moshe Rabbeinu did not write, if you will, in the sense of him coming up with content, for example. And thus, for example, like one day writing it in the text, okay, well, I'm going to pass away in this way, but instead that it was dictated to him by Hashem. And one of the explanations for this is that it was done by a process called nevuah, where, for example, if you will, looking at it using an English term, Moshe Rabbeinu was in an elevated state where Hashem showed him what was supposed to be written in the Torah, including all the spacing and the lettering and things like that. And then from there, he was simply taking dictation from what he saw and what he, heard in the state of nevuah. So what that means is essentially the structure, the content, the spelling, the spacing. None of that came from Moshe Rabbeinu. He made no decision about what was going to be the content, the structure, the spelling, or the spacing. All of that came from the design that Hashem gave him, and it was simply his job to basically take, animal skin, make ink, and then simply like write what he was saying in Nevuah, verbatim, for example. So there's no element of the Torah, according to this position that is, the claim, historical claim of Torah Moshe Jews and Orthodox Jews. None of it came from Moshe Rabbeinu. So, the question being, how could he write about his own death, for eventually, for example, and how could that be in the text itself is that he didn't come up with the content. So what that would mean essentially is that, for, most people who are familiar with the text, for example, they know the Torah is broken up into different parts of Bereshit, Shamoth, Vayikro, Bamidbar, Devorim. Essentially, what people call in English the five books of Moses or the Torah scroll. So essentially, at the end of the day, everything that is in the content of those texts, it comes from Hashem. It doesn't come from Moshe Rabbeinu himself. So in order to understand this concept, you would also have to take into account that the Torah-based claim is that Hashem knows all aspects of time simply because of one simple factor, which I've mentioned in other videos, and that Hashem is the source of all creation, meaning that Hashem is the source of the concept of creation and the ability to create. What that would mean is that all elements of, for example, the natural world, of what we experience and what we don't know about, what we don't experience, and what's beyond our world, all of that was created by Hashem, including the idea of time and the ability for there to be time, past, present, and future, and then all the possibilities. So that being the case, Hashem, basically dictated to Moshe Rabbeinu what content to put in the Torah, including, the concept of, for example, it being written a certain way so that the Jewish people would have things that we can analyze. So what that would mean is that, when someone asks the question, okay, well, obviously Moshe Rabbeinu couldn't have written about his own death. Well, obviously, if he's creating the text, yes, he could not do that. But if he's not the one coming up with the content, then, obviously the source of creation would know there's a reason for putting his death in the Torah. So there is a concept, for example, of, the reasons why. But again, that's, there's mentions of that in Jewish, like text, for example, in Jewish discussion about why Moshe Rabbeinu passed away before coming to the land of Israel. And there's a lot of more complex to it than what most English speakers would read in an English text. Knowing that the Hebrew text is the text and not like an English translation, we know that it's important to have the original text and also the context of the text. And the only people who, for example, had the context originally would be the Israeli/Jewish people, and that's something that our ancestors passed down throughout the generations to us in the modern time. So, in conclusion, essentially, when Moshe Rabbeinu placed the Torah in front of the Jewish people, he wasn't placing something in front of the Jewish people that is, his own ideas or his own concepts, for example. He placed something that, was already, in, the concept that Hashem wanted, to be put in the text. One of the ideas being that shows up in Jewish text about this is that, the transmission we received is something that existed before time. So the content of the Torah was something that Hashem, if you will, had in mind before even humanity came about, before the universe came about. And that essentially what Moshe Rabbeinu was doing was copying, whatever commentary Hashem wanted to pass on to the Israeli/Jewish people. And that's essentially what the Torah is. If you want to kind of summarize it in one way or the other, it's a commentary of the Creator of all things to the Jewish people, written in the language of, Torah-based Jewish people, in the language language of men, but specifically in the Hebrew language, in the language of men. So essentially, there's no way a person can escape the fact that the Hebrew text is the text. A translation is not the text. So whenever we as Torah-based Jews or Torah-based Jews, for example, look into investigate the text, we always have to go back to the original language it was in with the original context it was in. So that answers that question. So this is Ehav Ever from the Chronology of Ehav Ever. Thank you for listening. Take care and bye.